Where does the word Rom come from? Well, almost certainly an Indian word. It's their misfortune in the 16th century to be the archetypal foreigners, along with Jews and those Africans who were in Europe. And I think the nation state defined itself against these foreigners. Political identity of the groups we call gypsies coalesced around particular military centres which were part of those migrations. So you've probably got an army that was recruited of very different groups from within India. And probably the majority of that were actually people used to travelling, commercial nomads, the people who are known as Banjara or Goa in India today, the people whom we call the gypsies of India. And they probably were the foot soldiers of this army.
Most Roma intellectuals look to India as their homeland, okay? But at the same time, they recognize and they consider themselves Europeans first, and rightfully so, I think.
Egyptian was then used in Shakespeare's day, and it got shortened to gypsy. Of course, it's only become a derogatory term as both the Romanis in Britain have been looked down on, and to some extent during imperial times the poor Egyptians were looked down on, to be gypped, you know, the term to be gypped, to be swindled.
The method of the survival of Romani culture from the 16th to the 19th century was one of secrecy and hiding it. Now this wasn't the case in the earliest stage of Roma migration, right? Until the end of the first quarter of the 16th century, up to the 1520s, Roma were not secretive about their language. We've got Romani vocabularies dating back to the end of the Middle Ages. They had sophisticated political leaders who could go and negotiate with nobles, perhaps even the Pope, the Emperor of Germany and so forth. We don't know whether they actually met them or not, or whether they faked up the charters, as some people have suggested. But even if they faked them up, they were people of political sophistication adequate to do that.
Ay, curri, curri, curro, heredela, Monturno, herede, Monturno, herede, Monturno.
The steam engine means oppressed people from Eastern Europe can escape on trains to Western Europe and on boats to North America. It also means that coming the other way, the corn and agricultural produce of North America can come and beat up European agriculture. So you've got a fresh round of intense economic change, and you start to get massive migration of Romani communities abroad. You may have between 250,000 and 500,000 Roma leaving Eastern Europe and going to North America. So it's in the 19th century we begin to find renewed projects of expulsion and ultimately of extermination against Roma. Gypsies were the people whom they didn't really know where to send them back to. So at first they tried expulsion, and then they found laws of genocide. And right across Europe, you found similar laws of proscription, expulsion, or genocide against Roma.
El hombre más importante se asoma al espejo y ve su propia mentira.
Then people not only want and find it possible to be proud of a distinctive culture, but unfortunately with culture, then people not only want to feel that their culture is different, but it's superior as well.
And I don't think we've begun to see yet the impact of the historical knowledge and consciousness embodied in Romani experience down the centuries onto European consciousness. I mean, what I've seen during the 30 years that I've been involved with Roma has never ceased to astound me.
The Romani movement consists of a lot of Romani elites today who are trying, many of them are really trying to reach out to various Romani communities who don't have access to much of this information about their culture, about their history, okay? But fortunately, the Romani intellectuals are now beginning to write their journals, write their books, engage in media.
They can come to kill us here whenever they want. They have already set fire to us. What can we expect after all this? Nothing good for sure. This is Hungary. This is how it is, showing an example. This is how it was to join the EU, when the minorities, the Romanis, are totally oppressed.
People sometimes ask if there is something special about the Roma that leads them to be the victims of so much hatred, and my answer to that is an emphatic no.
We've never conquered other people's lands. We've never subjugated people. We've never enslaved them. We've never went out to kill them. All we've offered them has been our culture, our work, and our music. And why do they hate us?
Such is the attitude towards the Roma that elements of the establishment, including the police, the criminal justice systems in these countries, the education systems, people within them feel that they are able to discriminate against the Roma, harass Roma people, give them less of a service, abuse them without any real comeback, without any real sanction.
For the last several hundred years, one of the characteristic features of Roma people's experience throughout Europe has been hostility from the state.
So this is Dover Docks. This is where most of the refugees come in, either as port of entry applicants or as in-country applicants in the back of lorries or other clandestine ways.
About the Romanians who are up here, the parasites. They are very bad for the area, very, very bad. Thieving, begging. They're over here on our hospitality, and you know, they are a nuisance.
I know why they're here, and I think it's very unfortunate, but I don't like them begging on the streets and harassing me in restaurants, which I've had several times.
A lot of people take pity on the people themselves, but basically, I mean, they're living off the backs of us, and there's no need for them to be up here. I think they should be sent back to their own country. I mean, obviously there are a minority that are persecuted, but I think the majority of them, obviously over here on the meal ticket, is basically it's out of order.
They're too much trouble. Too much trouble. Well, I haven't met them, but with what you hear on television and different things, you know, they're not very nice people.
When they first came in '96, there wasn't much of a problem. People didn't know much about it. They saw a few more people who weren't white walking around that they, just assumed they were tourists or, let people be. But then, of course, the press got hold of things. Initially, supposedly from a Home Office leak about thousands of Slovakian gypsies arriving, which completely was untrue. The refugees that I've worked with from Slovakia, from what they tell me, it's just like apartheid. They can't get proper education, they can't go to schools, they can't get proper medical attention. It's very hard for them to get any work of any decent standard of work, otherwise it's like road sweeping, that type of work. They have no opportunities, so if they are discriminated against like this from birth till the day they die, to me that is persecution.
The report that I did was to find out the extent of the contemporary problems that the Roma community face, particularly in those candidate countries like the Czech Republic, like Slovakia, Slovenia, Romania. Those countries now have what I would see as almost state-sponsored racism against the Roma community, and where there isn't almost state sponsorship of that racism, there is a huge problem of community racism, establishment racism against the Roma community.
Previously, in the 1980s, this is a very interesting statistic, almost 80% or more of Romani men were employed. It means that they had food on their table, right? Now we have a situation where 70% of Roma, or more than 70% of Roma, are unemployed. Okay, we're talking about very serious and harsh economic climate right now for the majority of Roma.
The point has to be made that obviously in a communist society, which is heavily centralized and heavily controlled, then it's much easier in a sense to give them a clearly defined place, position, in a sense to protect them. It's when, of course, the whole structure of that society collapses or is dismantled without anything effectively being put back in its place, that puts them in danger and puts them at risk.
There's always been a Roma community in the UK, but even that community is vilified by people who would otherwise consider themselves to be fairly tolerant. This is the one ethnic minority community that everyone seems to dump on.
In the main, they live just on the outskirts of all cities or villages. It's a scrap heap. I've actually seen gypsy villages where, you know, so they live by a rivulet, which is very much like sewer. I mean, I've seen them take water from a place where turds are floating by, and you know, and then they boil it obviously, but you know, sort of it is no. I tell you, you know, some of the conditions that I've seen, you know, in Eastern Europe is comparable to what is happening in the worst, in the poorest parts of the world, you know, in South America and Africa and Asia.
Members of minorities are generally the poorest of the poor, and anyone who has seen a Roma settlement, as I have in Slovakia, which to all intents and purposes in the countryside looks like you could be in Austria or a relatively prosperous European country, and then to look down a hill at a shanty town on a mud bank in the middle of a river with no toilets, no electricity, people living in corrugated tin houses, no facilities at all. It's absolutely shocking, and there is no doubt that the Roma in Europe are far and away the most marginalised and deprived group, socio-economically speaking.
And we were in the town when we walk on the walk with the children, and a skinhead attacked me all in the Czech Republic and started beating me before the children because they thought children are white, I was black, therefore I was beaten. The children was very surprised and was crying.
Skinheads have been committing an increasing number of serious racially motivated crimes against Roma, against both property and against individuals. The result of this has been a series of racist murders and a large number of racist attacks.
So long as you're in a main entertainment arena, you're absolutely accepted. There are some great bands here like Ando Drum and Kaliyag. The moment you spread back out into the streets of a small town like Gyöngyös in the Matra Mountains, then it's quite dangerous.
Well, traditionally on the elbow it was a sign of a murderer or a gangland killing, especially to have tattoos on the elbows, especially with to colour the shield red, white and blue, or just to leave it grey shading.
The problem of Western governments simply demanding from East European states that they end discrimination against the Roma really ignores the fact that in each of these countries racism is institutionalized and can be found at every level of society. It's not just a question of a few ignorant people or a few skinheads causing trouble.
Suits and all that. The whole question of the far right in Europe is one that is complex, and the power structures of the far right go up and down. So in France, at the moment, the control is lessening. In Austria, clearly it's heightening with the movement towards a coalition government of a far right party. The real question is, what influence and power do the far right have? And the pattern that I see emerging is much more clever, sophisticated politicians using far-right agendas, mainstreaming those far-right agendas in anti-immigrant feelings, and that the skinheads and the louts, if you like, are a front for much of that more sophisticated activity.
Anti-Roma prejudice exists in local government, in national government, at the police, in hospitals, in the schooling system, everywhere.
One thing is, of course, the general rise in the standards of living in Eastern Europe, because on the whole, people who have jobs and houses and wives and children don't go around beating other people up, whatever they might think. It's the young people who are unemployed that do this. And therefore, there needs to be some general effort to raise the standard of living for everybody, so they don't need a scapegoat. Well, having said that, just because they are unemployed, there's no reason why they should go around throwing bricks through gypsies' houses.
Roma continue to be the scapegoats, okay, in many situations. In many countries in Europe, you can say that there has been a great deal of education which fights anti-Semitism, right? But that kind of education, that kind of literature, that kind of curriculum is not there in Europe with respect to Roma. And, well, Jews now have their homeland, Israel, but Roma don't.
My impression from doing the report that I did is that the police harassment of the Roma is of the worst kind of racism by any police forces around the European Union.
We find that in some of these countries, it's actually the police who are taking part in these attacks. In Bulgaria and Romania in particular, we know that the police in plain clothes, or sometimes not in plain clothes with masks, have been attacking gypsy settlements. So one can't expect a gypsy to go and complain to the police when it may be a policeman who's actually been leading this attack.
The camp was situated, I guess deliberately, I don't know, between one of the army bases and the town. The army guard the camp. It's sort of in effect fortified all the way around. You can't get into it without being cleared through the army checkpoint. You can't get out of it without going through the army control. And the Romanies in the camp don't want to go out of it. They are at risk if they do. So they're really confined.
The Roma National Congress is one of the most active in this whole Kosovo issue, and I really applaud them for that. Without them, even the small amount of information that we have today about what's happening, this new ethnic cleansing, even this new cultural genocide of Roma in Kosovo, we wouldn't know about it. We wouldn't find out about it. Roma had been forcibly removed from their homes by ethnic Albanians. That many of their homes had been burned, been looting, there had been rapes of Romani women. The same kind of thing that we saw by the Serbian forces against the ethnic Albanians months before.
The worst off, having not really been involved in the dispute between the Serbian authorities and the Albanian Kosovars over the last 10 years, they are now evicted from their houses, nowhere to return to, held in camps, not knowing where they're going to, how they're going to be treated in the future. They'd got to the point where, when we asked them what they most wanted, they just replied they wanted to get out of the area. They didn't really want to be rehoused in Kosovo, certainly didn't want to be rehoused in Serbia. They wanted to go to what they called as a third country, and that's what they mean by that, a Western European country.
What happened? The mayor of Hostility decided to build a wall to separate some flats where gypsies were living from the rest of the town, and he did it. I mean, the wall was built for the gypsies, and some other people stopped it for a couple of days. Then the police came along and protected the builders while they were building the wall. The central government decided they wanted to stop this, but they found they couldn't legally do it. And One spokesman for the Czech government said if the mayor of Ústí nad Labem wanted to build a concentration camp, we couldn't stop him doing it. We might be able to stop him sending people there, perhaps, but we couldn't actually stop him building a concentration camp under Czech law. Now, the Western powers put considerable pressure on the Czech government and said, you will not join the common market unless this wall comes down. And it's come down, though we hear it's going to go up again. But at this moment it's down. They started off by saying the gypsies had to be kept under control. There was a policy of sterilisation. Then the next step was to make Germany gypsy-free, Zigeunerfrei, as they say. When Hungary first joined the Axis, they were put into labour battalions to work with the army digging trenches on the Eastern Front. And then when the war started, with the invasion of Poland, they came across large numbers of gypsies. We're talking about 2 to 3 million or more. And then the policy of extermination began. And they killed gypsies where they found them, or they took them into camps. So as the war went on, more and more gypsies were killed, and we think, those of us who studied it, that if the war had continued, then all the gypsies in Europe would have been wiped out.
In Hitler's Germany, people were labeled, Roma in fact, were labeled as unter der Menschen, life, unworthy of life.
And there are very disturbing reports of, for example, in Hungary, some politicians favouring sterilisation and other quite horrific attitudes. And the real worry for people in the mainstream within the European Union, particularly when enlargement happens, but also before enlargement, that countries that join the European Union cannot tolerate systematic discrimination. The European Union, who don't want to see intolerance, is the worrying historical similarities between many of the attitudes towards the Roma now in those countries and the ideas perpetrated by the Nazis in the 1930s about the Roma.
Yugoslavia was one of the countries which suffered a great deal during the Second World War under the Nazi occupation, and Gypsies and Jews were persecuted, particularly with the alliance of the Ustaši in Croatia. And Tito, who himself was Croatian but became unified Yugoslavia, started a partisan movement, and a lot of Gypsies fought with Tito, and one of his promises to get the Gypsies fighting for him was that they would, at some point after, once victory was attained, there would be a Gypsy homeland or an autonomous area in Yugoslavia for Gypsies. Unfortunately, he did not keep this promise after the war, but he did allow Gypsies relative freedom, much greater freedom than than in other Eastern European countries, so that a great number of Gypsy intellectuals who were very active in the Romani movement really emerged from Yugoslavia because they had the opportunity to be educated.
Roma routinely denied access to pubs, to restaurants, to discos, to swimming pools.
Did you say to the defendant, you'll get in my bar when you are drinking?
I don't like the term bogus asylum seekers, and I think it's very emotive, and it's, I think this whole subject should be looked at in as rational a way as possible.
The question of asylum has become very complex, though, because first of all we have the definition of what asylum is. Does asylum amount to this kind of ethnic discrimination that they suffer, or is it just confined to persecution and torture or war situations?
It's not a question that states do nothing. All of them are doing something. But the rising number of Roma asylum seekers demonstrates that even if they're doing the right thing, they're doing it on too small a scale.
citizenship and ideas of citizenship, which are always about who belongs and who doesn't belong, can be no basis of that. The concept of citizenship is irredeemably racist. When people talk about promoting citizenship, it may sound very inclusive, but of course it's always about who is not included. When our government talks about inclusion, it's usually a prelude to its beefing up its efforts to keep out the people who are running away from violence and murder in other countries. The only basis for promoting human rights is an ideology of human rights. The ideology of citizenship can't do that.
In looking at the Roma situation, was that there was a real anxiety in countries like Austria, who border on many of these candidate countries, that through the European Union enlarging, there will be free movement rights for Roma people. They will become citizens of the European Union. So although they've been excluded from in their own societies, they will in fact find the right of free movement to other countries.
Much the Roma, but in terms of asylum seekers generally and refugees, the countries of Central Africa, for example, Malawi and Tanzania, which are, as we all know, far poorer than the UK, they take a far higher proportion of refugees and they accept them as a fact of life and as their duty, whereas a relatively wealthy country like the UK seems unusually mean about being willing to support asylum seekers and give them asylum in this country. And we believe that there is a kind of racism that is implicit in doing nothing.
We take, for example, in the UK and the European Union, far less asylum seekers than most of the developing countries of the world, who take the biggest proportion of the world's asylum seekers.
Because the Home Office are issuing more or less standard refusals, I should say that the refusals are so standard that paragraph after paragraph is repeated in these letters. There's very little evidence that individual claims are being heard. In some cases, even refusal letters written for Slovaks are redistributed to Czech asylum seekers with the word Slovak crossed out and replaced by Czech in biro.
Well, the asylum law here is International Convention on Refugees, but it's been interpreted very strictly here. So I've been listening to tribunals where people have told their story, and the judge in the tribunal said, well, I've heard your story and I believe what you say, but it's not persecution, it's harassment. And the people that are doing it are not agents of persecution within the Refugee Convention, to which the gypsy doesn't understand a word what he's saying, and when it's translated probably doesn't understand even more. Many of the gypsies from Eastern Europe are going to these asylum hearings without any lawyers, so they don't have a chance to put their case. And there are a number of phrases that simply are meaningless, like agents of persecution, the difference between harassment and persecution, internal flight. These are just concepts which they don't understand, and very often they're not even translated properly. So we have found that only about 10 refugee families from Eastern Europe have given the right to remain here.
Because the onus is on the asylum seeker to prove that they have a genuine fear of persecution in their own country, and it's a very hard thing to actually prove with documentary evidence and so on. So because an asylum seeker fails to meet those tests or fails to prove their case, doesn't automatically mean that they fall into the other category of being a bogus asylum seeker. They obviously still have very good reasons for wanting to leave their own country, but they've just failed to meet that test.
I think that racist assumptions have been one of the reasons why the Home Office have found it so easy to persuade the adjudication system that in fact Roma are here for economic reasons and for no other.
The British government should give the right to remain for a short period to people coming from Eastern Europe who've been very much harassed, and then they can go back when the political situation becomes easier.
Once peace is re-established in a country, then you would hope that those people could go back. And I think a lot of them would want to. It's their home.
I suppose that the same problems that all asylum seekers have, which is settling in here. It's not easy. On the one hand, they don't really want to be here, and yet the circumstances are making them come to this country and try and start a new life. Also, they're living in a, if you like, a state of limbo for a very long period of time because cases take so long to have decisions made on them. So they're very uncertain about their future. Therefore, it's hard for them to actually get on with their lives.
The other big problem is the political problem, which exists not just in the United Kingdom but in other major EU countries like France and Germany. And that is this kind of Dutch auction between political parties for who is going to be toughest on the question of asylum seekers and who is going to be the knight in shining armour. So some smaller parties who have no chance of power can quite easily claim that they would have a liberal asylum policy that they may never have to implement.
Now, you've got to give people a fair chance. We are signed up to the convention, we have to follow the rules, it's law.
The big debate here, as there is a debate in France and Germany and other countries, is the question of support for asylum seekers. How much money are they taking from the state? And my view is that as long as the Geneva Convention exists and that we sign up to it, we should expect a certain number of asylum seekers to come.
Our problem here, and I think it's a very practical problem, is that we are a relatively small island. But it's a problem for the European countries on the European mainland as well.
Romani children are 15 times more likely than non-Romani children to be placed in special schools for children with special needs, which effectively creates a segregated education system in the Czech Republic, in which Romani children are denied access to all secondary education de facto.
School children are facing the kind of discrimination that black children faced in the 50s and 60s in coming to the UK and France from the colonies. They're facing those kinds of problems, very subtle problems of underestimating their intelligence.
And certainly here in Hungary, where there are now good schools for the Roma to go to separately, there's a good tertiary college in Budapest and there is the famous Gandhi school in Pécs. I think among the Roma there is, for those who want their children to go to school at all, there's the question of whether they become even more segregated if they go to special schools, and whether it's better to go to schools where there are other communities, people of Magyars and Slovaks and Romanians, other people going to school as well, or whether it's better to have a space of their own in which they can become educated.
Hungarian schools are basically for the middle class. Primary and secondary schools are not for those above or below the middle. The majority of our children are poor and belong to a subculture of poverty, ethnic poverty at that. Schools do not recognize this, do not take into account the type of knowledge and values. I have got to like the school for many additional reasons. It's not just the free to create a middle-class milieu at school, to give the children the background their homes lack. The reason I came here initially was because I was attracted by the freedom. Later, I like the fact that I am amongst Romanis and that I get to meet people. This does not really feel like a school. It feels like a club where we happen to spend our time studying. After primary school, I'd like to go to a business middle school in order to study further, and then I'd like to be a sales assistant.
There were hardly any pencils that we saw. There was certainly nothing like a blackboard or even any writing materials in the school. There was some paper, and they had made some pictures which were up on the board. I do remember there was one picture that a Roma child had done that was on the board of a sort of before and after. And there was a picture of standard, it must be universal child's picture of a house, and a triangle at the top and a square at the bottom, and a path going away from it, and that was where they had been. and then there was just a sort of muddy splodge, which was where they were now.
Okay, tell me about this. What's that?
I'm amazed, though, that the hostility has been open. Normally it is a reserve, a failure to welcome, rather than an attack. And the attack I can only explain on the present social level, where there is unemployment and young people feel that somehow they're missing out. There's far more movement of people. It does create problems. We have different social structures in place. I can see some of the financial, the economic arguments. I think they're much exaggerated, because if you compare the expenses, which if you say it quickly sounds a lot, if you compare those expenses that go to supporting asylum seekers anywhere in Europe, compare it with the amount you can win on the lottery any Saturday of the year, and it pales into insignificance. So I think the financial is exaggerated.
So when we look at Roma in the 20th century, what has happened with learning to read and write is not that Romany culture is being destroyed. That's what sort of well-meaning liberals will say, you know, why teach them to read and write? You're destroying this oral culture. Or they're being converted to Pentecostalism, they're losing their culture. Well, none of that is true, right? Romany culture with Pentecostalism is like Romany culture with pepper and salt on it.
Hungary has taken a very interesting approach in addressing the needs of its Roma population. The Hungarian government also supports special representative institutions for the Roma called minority self-government, and Roma representatives have a direct input into decisions made by local government and the national government itself.
Hogy egy népesség szempontjából a képzettségi szint az oktatás.
Today, more than 80% of Romanis living here speak only Hungarian. 10 years ago, this was a smaller percentage. 75%. There is no Romani language teaching at school, except at the Gandhi High School, which is a middle school. The last 40 years have brought a significant linguistic assimilation for Romanis and other ethnic minorities in Hungary.
It's provided space now for minorities in Hungary to organize and to speak out about their own interests, about their community's interest. So in the fields of education and culture. So it's a very important symbolic step.
Well, it's what would be called, I suppose, in the United States, positive discrimination.
Való igaz, hogy Magyarország ebben az intézményrendszerben, a kisebbségi önkormányzatok rendszerében.
Speaking of a long-term strategy, this may mean 10, 15 or 20 years, we would like to achieve a significant improvement to the social indicators of the Romas as regards employment, education, their position within society, housing, even life expectancy.
The implementation of those laws has fallen behind because of lack of financing system and lack of independence, because the minority governments which have been formed on the basis of this law, the so-called minority self-governments, are subordinated to the local self-governments, which are run for the most part by Hungarians. And in fact, the financing of those the minority self-governments is also subordinated to the local self-governments. So what you have is this parallel structure of local self-governments and then the minority self-governments, which have a voice, let's say, for Roma, who are the largest minority in Hungary, but can't really do much.
Itt valójában arról van szó, hogy
What we are talking about here is that the Hungarian government, of whichever party, expects local government to solve these conflicts. It is quite clear that such conflicts cannot be solved by a local authority. That is for the simple reason that they are an elected body and want to be re-elected. If they are seen to be friendly to the Romas, they will probably not be voted in next time, since in these settlements the atmosphere is fundamentally anti-gypsy.
It's too early to cite Hungary's approach as a model which could be used for other states. It's an interesting development, and it certainly gives the Hungarian government much greater scope to find out what the real problems are and to address them. However, time will tell the extent to which they embrace these opportunities and put in place policies that allow Roma people to live their lives freely.
With the Roma in particular, we have a mentoring approach whereby we work with the leading members of Roma organisations and give them the support and the framework in which they can do the training themselves for younger and less experienced members of their communities in order to develop a stronger organisational base. Roma need to have access to the mainstream economy, they need to have income earning opportunities, they need to have opportunities to generate their own livelihoods.
Getting into short-term employment, I think administratively it would be very expensive. Obviously you'd have to keep track of them while they were while they were working. And so there are tremendous problems, I think, administratively over that. I think the solution is to speed up the whole processing of applications so people don't have to wait up to a year.
That there has to be the political will within the European Union, particularly when enlargement happens, but also before enlargement, that countries that join the European Union cannot tolerate systematic discrimination against the Roma. The Roma people themselves have taken steps to begin to identify themselves in the new millennium as a community.
Generális.
A general solution should be found in the shape of anti-discrimination laws. This is not just a Hungarian problem, it applies to the whole of Europe.
There will be Romani radio soon. I think in a great part of Eastern Europe. There will be Romani access TV in a great part of Eastern Europe. There will be publishing in Romani language. And I think all these things serve up to create something of a strong, reinforced identity.
Thinking over what we are actually reacting against, what it is that what we hold, let's say either what the Romani is, where from those ideas comes, what are my gut reactions towards something, where do I have them from? And still there would be a problem. These are all theoretical thinkings. Learning prepares you for practice when you actually again encounter the person who happens to be a Romani or another minority on the street and the different types of social situations. It's almost like a self-education with lots of learning.
I know what a lot of Europeans, what most Europeans think they know about modern Europe before we can understand the situation of the gypsies. It's not mysterious. It's fairly obvious to anybody who's got any kind of detailed acquaintance with Romani history. But it's very difficult to explain in a short compass. and then you try to persuade national governments to nationalise those positive policies. That was the general method of Romany politics in Great Britain, what led to the Caravan Sites Act and the development of gypsy education, which has meant that a generation of young Romany childs have learnt to read and write in this country and are able to use those techniques in addition to their own culture, which I assure you hasn't disappeared. Do I think there's a danger of renewed genocide in Eastern Europe? Well, yes, I do. I think that there are explicitly genocidal parties out there who have more chance of gaining power than they have had for a long time. The policies of expulsion can, as we see in the 16th century and in the 20th century, easily slide into policies of genocide. And therefore, yes, of course, there are dangers of genocide at the moment.
Well, I hope that there won't be another genocide, though when we see what's happening in other places like Chechnya and East Timor and Africa, one wonders.
The worry now is not that there will be any kind of new Holocaust. The worry now is that discrimination and harassment of the Roma people will be seen as acceptable. And that's the battle to fight against, that it is unacceptable. It also belittles the complicated problems they face of underestimating their intelligence, diverting them into bad careers. Do you see what I mean? To say there's a new Holocaust kind of tabloidizes the whole thing. It doesn't treat it with the sophistication, I think.
I think that building up of an international police force is important. I think building up of a more rapid European Court of Human Rights. We have to stop pandering to racism against migrants and say that that is an extremely ungenerous and unhelpful emotion, and it's just racism. It's not based in any real threat that the refugees pose to the people of Dover or anywhere else.
But it's interesting that race has become one of the first directives that the European Union is proposing, and this was voted through at some undue haste in the European Union. That's happening because of the concerns around Austria, of the images of war and Nazism being revived somewhat with Jörg Haider. But it's also happening because there is an understanding now that there are still substantial ethnic minority communities, visible communities like the Roma, who are suffering a great deal.
By the time my daughter phoned for the police and the fire services, my children have practically put out the fire. The policeman came and asked, "Who was it? Who did we see?" We didn't see anyone, we couldn't falsely accuse anyone.
Tényekhez hozzátartozik, hogy ezeknek az embereknek soha nem
In
volt
fact, these people have never owned their own homes.
termelőszövetkezet által
They moved into
elhagyott,
abandoned
már
buildings
lebontásra
that were marked for
épületekbe
demolition.
költöztek be. Tehát
When one of the
ezek a
roofs
életveszélyessé
caved
vált
in and
polgármester
became highly
azt
dangerous,
mondhatta el,
the previous
és hogy a
mayor
lakhatási
had them
feltételeket
demolished.
biztosítsa.
He offered them the village hall as temporary accommodation.
Művelődési házát ideiglenes szálláshelyül.
Én úgy gondolom, hogy I think they want to make us feel the same way they made us feel under the Germans when they took us out to Komárom. They took my parents to Auschwitz. They tortured them. They tortured us. This is what they want us to feel here in Hungary.
Obviously, there will always be those who would like to improve themselves economically, and they therefore go to those countries where they think they can do so. But that can't be just given carte blanche, because obviously if they come into the community, they may well contribute hugely to it if they're allowed to do so, but it is simply a question of the scale of the numbers and in the schools and so on. But the genuine refugees must always be admitted.
Maradj már! Abusza!
Ajke Isten, Isten, Isten. Jaj, te mikor lesz én nékem, de jaj, te szép szabad élet. Elkezded a
Complete mess of it. Una noche en La Habana, una noche en La Habana, una mulata conocí yo, bailaba también la rumba que con su baile me enamoró, me enamoró, me enamoró, me enamoró, me enamoró. Una noche en La Habana, una mulatita conocí yo. Tú me haces sentir amor de tal manera que yo la vida sin ti, que yo la vida sin ti no la quisiera llevar. Que yo soy de Andalucía, donde se sabe de amores, hasta aquí, hasta aquí, hasta aquí, a nuestros mayores, lerey, 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 llorando.